Let us imagine you're living in the heyday of the Roman Empire. From the outside, it looks glamorous, grand structures, legendary arenas, and a civilization that was arguably the most advanced in the world. But if you're not a Roman citizen, or worse, if you're a male slave, it's a different story. Many people think of slaves in Rome as simply the lower class who were manipulated. But in reality, their lives were much more brutal, oppressive, and terrifying. And today, we will delve into that world, where a man, just because he was captured in war or born in the wrong place, was turned into property, bought and sold, tortured, and even killed just because he displeased his master. From the moment a person was enslaved, all of their human rights were erased. They were no longer considered individuals, but walking property. They could be traded, sold like merchandise. They could be beaten without reason. And no matter who they were before, a brave warrior, teacher, or an anonymous peasant, once they fell into the hands of the Romans, they were labeled slaves and nothing more. The Roman slave system was highly sophisticated and highly organized. Slaves could be assigned to different niches. That is, they would be assigned to different positions according to their abilities or the needs of their masters. Some were sent to do domestic work, others were forced to do hard manual labor on farms or quarries, and a few were sent to the arena to become gladiators, a form of bloody entertainment that the Romans loved. But no matter what niche, one thing is common: they have no right to protest. Imagine a male slave waking up early in the morning in a dark, cramped, damp room with a dirty floor and stuffy air. He has no name, or if he does, it is only a name his master has given him for ease, sometimes even as a mockery. His day begins not with an alarm clock, but with the shouts and whips of his overseer. If you are a slave working on a farm, also known as latifundia, life was almost a living hell. These farms were often vast, owned by the Roman nobility. Slaves worked from sunrise to sunset, plowing, planting, harvesting, all with their bare hands, without any modern tools. In the summer they burned. In the winter they turned blue from the cold. And if someone collapsed from exhaustion, no one stopped to help, because that would have earned them a beating themselves. In the quarries and metal mines, the situation was even worse. These places resembled ancient death camps. The air was filled with toxic dust. There was no light, no food, and the danger of collapse was always present. Many slaves were forced to work themselves to death here, and death was sometimes the only escape from the nightmare. Not all slaves were menial, however. Some, especially those with education or good looks, were put to work in the homes of the wealthy. This may sound like a relief, but it was far from easy. They could be forced to work as servants, babysitters, cleaners, or even reluctant sexual partners. They were expected to maintain a polite, docile appearance at all times. A wrong look could be considered an insult and punished instantly. Another terrifying aspect of slavery was the absolute physical control. Male slaves were often examined like cattle before being purchased. Teeth, skin, muscles, even genitals were pulled out and examined. Metal tags were attached around their necks, stating, "I am the property of Master A. If I run away, bring me back here." Escaping was extremely difficult, because not only was there nowhere to go, but the slave surveillance system in the Roman Empire was very sophisticated. There were professional slave hunters, ready to hunt down and punish anyone who dared to defy fate. Once captured, punishment often went beyond flogging. Many were branded with a red-hot brand on their foreheads as a warning to others. Some had their tendons cut, while others were tied to posts and beaten to death in front of other slaves as an example. Even domestic slaves were not immune to the mental pressure. They had to guess at their master's every whim, satisfy their every whim, and live in a constant state of fear, of saying the wrong thing, of spilling a dish, of someone in their master's household disliking them. Every action could become an excuse to vent their anger. It is worth noting that, in the eyes of Roman society at that time, slaves had no rights. They were not protected by the law. They could not sue, were not allowed to marry officially, and their children, if they had any, would automatically become slaves. Perhaps most heartbreaking, however, is the way an entire cultural system rationalized this. The Romans saw slaves as necessary for the functioning of society. They convinced themselves that slave ownership was a natural part of the world order. Just as some were born to rule, so too were some born to serve. But that doesn't mean slaves didn't fight back. In the next section, we'll explore how these men fought back, from the silent ones to bloody uprisings, like the famous Spartacus rebellion. We have just mentioned a harsh reality. Being a slave in the Roman Empire meant the complete erasure of human dignity. But as is the case with humans, when pushed to the brink of suffering, the last thing that remains is the will to live and the spirit of resistance. And in the deepest darkness, sometimes there are unexpected rays of light. That is when slaves stand up, even though they know that the price to pay may be their own lives. Not everyone accepted their fate. From small acts like hiding food, lying about completed work, or whispering disapproving words, slaves always found ways to retain a part of their humanity in the life of being called property. And among the male slaves, there were some who not only dared to dream of freedom, but also dared to act to achieve it. You've probably heard of Spartacus, a gladiator slave forced to fight in the arena for the entertainment of crowds. But he wasn't just a fighter. He was a symbol of resistance. In 73 BC, Spartacus and a small group of about 70 other slaves revolted, stole weapons from the gladiatorial school, and escaped to Mount Vesuvius. The rebellion began, lasting nearly 2 years and drawing tens of thousands of slaves from across the empire. Imagine men who had been beaten and forced into submission, now taking up arms, organizing armies, and winning major battles against the Roman army. In the eyes of the ruling class, they were a serious threat. But for many other slaves, Spartacus and his army were the first sign of hope. However, as you might have guessed, this uprising was eventually crushed. The Roman army eventually crushed Spartacus' forces with overwhelming force and strategic cunning. Some 6,000 slaves captured after the final battle were crucified on crosses along the main road leading back to Rome as a chilling warning. Do not dream of freedom. As barbaric as it was, it is undeniable that this revolt forced the Romans to reconsider their slave system. From then on, they increased control, supervision, and even reform, not to protect the slaves, but to keep the system running more efficiently and with less risk. But not all male slaves wanted to rebel. Some chose a different path, trying to be freed through legal means. In the Roman Empire, though rare and difficult, it was possible for a slave to be freed, called a manumission. Usually this only happened if the slave served extremely faithfully, or the master felt generous at the end of his life, or when a slave was able to redeem himself. It sounds like there's a way out, but don't be fooled. Emancipation is like winning the lottery. It's so rare that many never even hope for it. And even if they are free, the former slave, called freed, will still have to live in the shadow of their former master. They can be bound by obligations, or recalled at any time if they disobey. However, some male slaves with special talents gradually advanced. Some became doctors, some writers, or teachers. Because the Romans valued knowledge, they sometimes used highly educated slaves to teach their children or to take charge of economic management. A few of these later became prominent figures in society, but these were only a fraction of the millions of people who were condemned. In particular, those who worked in the arena, the gladiators, were often admired by the people for their bravery. But remember, their lives were like walking a tightrope between life and death. Each match could end in bloodshed, and if their performance was not dramatic enough, they could be executed right on the stage to please the audience. They were stars, but also bloody puppets in the hands of the upper class. Not only did they have to endure beatings or forced labor, male slaves were also often violated physically and honorably. Some masters turned slaves into objects of sexual satisfaction. They were used as toys. without the right to refuse or the right to demand. Even in some noble families, handsome slaves were forced to disguise themselves as women to serve at parties, or to be made fun of during festivals. Even more cruel, they were castrated to serve in positions that required absolute loyalty, such as babysitting or taking care of female masters. In large cities like Rome, there were entire brothels filled with male slaves, forced to sell themselves to customers without the right to say no. All the money they earned went into the owner's pockets. They lived in squalor, disease, and despair, with no other choice. Perhaps the most painful thing is, the more submissive an obedient slave is, the easier it is to be forgotten. They disappear into history like shadows, without names, without memories, and no one to mourn them when they die. And let's not forget, if a male slave had a wife or children, his family was not legally recognized. The child was automatically the property of the owner. Families could be torn apart at any time. Mothers sold in one place, children taken away in another, never to be seen again. It was a pain that burned for generations, and no voice could tell. But in that nightmare, the strange thing is that many people still find a way to love, to hope, to cling to the remaining humanity. They silently teach their children to read and write, share their meager food with friends in the same situation, or even simply smile to each other in the dark, to remind themselves that they are still human. In the final part, we will reach the culmination of this journey, exploring the last ways in which male slaves managed to retain their dignity in a society that did not see them as human. You may be surprised at how they faced injustice and the silent legacies they left behind for posterity. We have gone through many dark corners of male slavery in the Roman Empire, from hard labor, physical abuse, to bloody and tearful rebellions. But what shocked many people the most was not just the cruelty of the system, but how it infiltrated every corner of life, making people forget that those slaves, they had dreams, emotions, pasts, and even small hopes. Many male slaves learned to live a double life, to be submissive on the outside, while still keeping a part of themselves to themselves. It might be memories of the distant homeland that were taken from as children, a real name they whispered in their heads at night, or an old song they hummed softly when no one was listening. These seemingly small things were the only way they could hold on to themselves in a world that sought to erase them. Some people tried to learn to read and write, knowing that if they were discovered, they would be severely punished. Some people secretly wrote poems, carved small lines on bricks and stones telling the story of their lives, as a way to prove, I have lived, loved, suffered. There were short poems, scribbles that were found by archaeologists centuries later, and they told stories that were never recorded in official history books. You might be surprised to learn that some male slaves became philosophers. It may sound unbelievable, but it is true. A great example is Epictetus, a slave who was crippled by his master, but he founded the Stoic school of philosophy. He taught that while you can't control what happens to you, you can always control how you react. In the most dire of circumstances, his philosophy was not a cry for help, but a way to persevere. And that's what made the difference. Not all slaves succumbed. Many of them chose to fight back quietly, with kindness. They cared for one another, shared their meager rations, protected the weaker members of their group. In a society that encouraged cruelty, these quiet acts of kindness were the most powerful form of resistance. But there were also more desperate choices. Some chose to end their lives to avoid further humiliation. Some committed suicide by hanging themselves, some by throwing their heads against walls, some by setting themselves on fire. They did so not out of weakness, but because they saw no way out. The silence of their deaths was a loud cry to Roman society. I no longer want to live as an object. The Romans understood the fear of losing power. They knew that the slightest hint of weakness could bring down the slave system. So they created strict laws, threatening rituals, and bloody entertainment to assert their power. But no matter how many monuments they built or how many parades they staged, there was always a small, inviolable area within the heart of every slave, where they retained their last freedom, their mind. Perhaps most heartbreaking of all, many slaves lived their entire lives without leaving a trace. No tombstones, no papers, no names recorded in history books. They existed only as quiet shadows in tax records or statistics in farm registers. But if we are here today telling their story, then they were not completely gone. Some modern historians have devoted their lives to studying the lives of slaves, not to glorify their suffering, but to give voice to the forgotten. Broken pottery, handwritten inscriptions, even a faint imprint on the floor can help to reconstruct a portrait of the people who lived, suffered, and hoped. Today, when we look back at the Roman era, we often think of emperors, generals, and great works. But perhaps the real foundation of that empire was not marble or gold. It was the sweat, blood, and tears of millions of slaves. The life of a male slave in Rome is not only a tragedy, it is also a testament to the extraordinary resilience of human beings. They were stripped of almost everything: freedom, dignity, even their humanity. And yet they found ways to survive, to love, to fight back, and to remind us today that every unjust system, no matter how great, will eventually be questioned, will eventually face the truth. And if there is one thing we can learn from these men, who were once called slaves, it is that people are not things to be owned. Every person, no matter where they were born, in any era, deserves to be respected, to live as a real human being.